All right, y'all, we are trying our hand here at recording a lecture. And the good news is you're not going to have to watch me give the lecture. You can just listen to my mellifluous voice and just imagine that I'm wandering around at the front of the class waving my pointer around and generally just being obnoxious like I normally am. Hopefully, y'all will actually pay some level of attention to the lecture and not just run it in the background like you do when you're taking the online driver safety class when you get a ticket or other online trainings that you have to take. But can't really do much about that, so we'll do the best we can. I will try and keep these interesting. They'll probably be a little bit shorter than lectures normally are in class, just because obviously there won't be as much interaction or questions. Not that y'all ask a lot of questions, but that sort of time that we have when we do discuss some particular issues obviously can't happen via this format. So bear with me. I appreciate y'all's patience as we go through this. I know this is not easy for you either, trying to manage this learning online, and it's been a stressful week or two as we've kind of gone through this, and hopefully you're at home safe with your family and not driving each other too crazy as you're cooped up. So bring your family around, make this a family affair. You can all learn together, and then you can have fun discussing where I'm wrong and how off base I am on some of this stuff. Hopefully not too much of that, but you never know. So today we are shifting gears from our focus on kind of urban development and urban issues, and the infrastructure stuff that we were talking about last week, and we're going to dive into this idea of food security and some of the issues and challenges with the food system. The next lecture will actually focus more on sustainable agriculture and some of the opportunities and challenges with that. But today we're going to talk about food security and ways that we can maybe address some of that. So how do we define food security? Sorry, let's go here. All right, there's kind of four key ideas here, and first and foremost is lack of access to food. That's pretty simple, but that may be both a financial and a physical access to food issue. Obviously, for low-income families and people, right, they may just not have enough money to purchase adequate food that they need for their families. Maybe a question of what's available in their neighborhoods as well, and so so that kind of falls into the physical access to food, in terms of if you live in a low-income neighborhood, you're less likely to have access to a full-service grocery store or to reasonably priced healthy foods. A lot of what we see in low-income neighborhoods are convenience stores, bodegas that have food options, but they're not necessarily the most healthy. Also, we see a lot more fast food options available as well. So just physical access to food can be a problem. And this idea of running out of food and not being able to acquire more. So that can again be a physical and a financial issue. If you have a certain budget for food and you have an unexpected expense that you need to spend money on, right? A lot of that money that you had budgeted for food could go to pay for a new tire if you get a flat tire, or you get sick and you need medicine. So suddenly now your food budget gets taken by something else, and so you don't have the budget to get your food till your next paycheck or whatever. Additionally, again, with physical access for people who are transit dependent or otherwise mobility impaired, sometimes again if they're in a neighborhood without proximity to a grocery store, that can create a challenge. So the time it takes to get to a full service grocery store to do the weekly shopping or however often people need to can be a problem. It can take a long period of time out of their day for people who are working shift work and jobs like that. They may not be able to get to a store when it's open if they're working when the store is actually open. Additionally, some transit systems put limits on the number of bags that people can bring onto buses and trains. And so in that case, if you're trying to, say, buy groceries for a family of four, right, it could be a problem for you to have enough bags, be able to carry enough bags on the transit on the bus to feed your family. So you have to make multiple trips over the course of a week, which again, because you're reliant on the bus, take longer and are a much bigger inconvenience than for folks who have cars or have closer access to a grocery store. Next one is this idea of fear of running out of food. And so obviously that's a significant challenge for folks who are kind of on that cusp of financial stability, to where that unexpected expense could be the difference between having money to buy food for the week or not. And so that stress is just kind of underlies their whole life. And we've all been in those stressful situations where we're just kind of fearful of what's happening and what's going on. Obviously we're in one now with this coronavirus situation, but for folks who are food insecure, that stress is just a constant part of their life, that something's going to happen and they're going to have to use their food budget on some other expense that they're not ready for. And for particularly people with kids and family members to support, that's an enormous stressor. And finally, this idea of insufficient and low quality food is really just access to food. So we've talked about food deserts. We know what those are. We'll talk about them again here in a second. But when you're surrounded by convenience food, fast food, those kinds of things, right, it becomes easy to make the worse option, if you will, because sometimes it's about time. So if you're in between jobs, you work 2 or 3 jobs and you're just trying to rush from shift to shift, and it's like, oh, there's a fast food joint, I can spend $5, get enough food to last me for my next 8-hour shift. You're going to do that, right? The lack of time, the lack of resources means that you're going to take the convenient option. And in many of our low-income neighborhoods, the convenient option is fast food and unhealthy food. So it's not just about the amount of food that people are eating, it's about the nutritional value of that food as well. So flipping the switch to this idea of food security, again, 4 kind of key ideas, and you'll see how they connect back to food insecurity. The first is simply the physical availability of food, and that's not just access for people, we'll talk about that in a second, but just, is there enough food supply for the community or for the country? And so that comes down to where the food is grown, the agricultural productivity of the community and the country as a whole, how trade works. A lot of our food here in the United States comes from out of the country. We're bringing in food from all across Mexico, South America, other places, and it's coming here. But because we have a stable food system, we're not too worried about it. Obviously, you've seen some examples with the coronavirus. You've probably seen the news stories about stores running out of basic supplies. That's not an overall food supply issue. That's just a localized panic buying situation. And so, in the entire food system of the United States, we have more than adequate food to meet our needs. The challenge is that because people are freaking out with this coronavirus, they're buying more than they otherwise would, creating sort of a short-term access issue. So the next one is economic and physical access to food. And so obviously that comes down to, do you have the financial capacity to buy the food that you need? And then, is that food accessible in your neighborhood? So as we talked about just a minute ago, if you own a car, it's pretty easy to get food. You can drive to a grocery store even if it's 5 or 10 miles away without really thinking too much about it. But if you're dependent on transit or you're dependent on walking, that makes it a much different conversation about how we access food and how much food we can actually access at any given time if you're trying to carry bags onto a bus. So food utilization comes down to this idea of the nutrition of the food that's available to you. Again, in many of our low-income neighborhoods, the food that is available is convenience food. It's fast food. It's not very nutritionally dense. So it's a lot of processed foods, not a lot of the fresh, healthy vegetables that give us the nutrients that we need. So even though people may have access to an adequate amount of food because it's not nutritionally balanced. It's not giving them proper nutrition, and so you can have some of the same issues and health effects of malnutrition really because of a lack of nutrient issue rather than a lack of calorie issue, if that makes sense. And then the stability of the dimensions over time is really how stable the food system is. Do people feel secure in the availability and access to food? So here in the United States, again, we have a stable food system overall. There is not a lack of food across the country and across most cities or communities. There may be localized issues where there are food deserts or other specific conditions in a particular neighborhood, but overall our food system is adequate outside of those, in individual neighborhoods. For low-income families, that stability is missing, and that contributes to that idea of food stress, to where families and individuals have that kind of baseline stress level of worrying where their next meal is going to come from, or if not their next immediate meal, but 2 or 3 or 4 days down the line. Will they be able to get to the store? Will they have time between their jobs? Those kinds of stressors that just create tension in your life kind of day to day is an enormous impact. And so if we can have stability for folks and they can be confident in their next meal, that adds a certain level of comfort in people's lives and reduces that level of stress. All right, so we've talked about Thomas Malthus. He was the guy in the 18th century or 19th century, whenever it was, who talked about the population increase being exponential, food increase being linear, and at some point we would run out of food. And then, of course, Norman Borlaug, who we talked about as well, with the Green Revolution and massive increases in food productivity, really kind of put the lie to this idea of the Malthusian trap. And so we've been able to increase food production adequately to support a growing population worldwide. Now, certainly there are still localized issues and so forth that we've talked about and will talk about, but overall there is adequate food supply for the globe. We just need to get it to where people need it and make it cost effective for them. And of course, the environmental impact of the Green Revolution has been the increase in pesticides, fertilizers, herbicide use, leading to pollution issues as things are not being properly applied, so you get runoff and all those things that we've talked about before. Additionally, we've become more reliant on proprietary seeds and GMOs, and so instead of farmers being able to reserve some of their seeds from year to year as they did in the past, now farmers are in many cases purchasing seeds every year, which is a cost to them, and so they're not able to just recycle some of their product to start next year's crop. They actually have to buy from a seed manufacturing company, basically, those seeds every year, which is a significant cost, and also leads to more homogenization in the crops that we're growing, which creates the potential for threats from pests, diseases, those kinds of things that can come into these monocultures and really decimate the crops if because they are just all the same species, all the same type, everything growing in these massive patches. So certainly some challenges that arise from sort of our industrial agriculture model, but it has been enormously successful in feeding the growing population of the world. So malnutrition, despite increases in food production, we still have parts of the world where malnutrition remains a problem. Many in the developing nations in particular don't get enough food. There's just not enough calories available to them. And again, much of that is an issue of availability in their country or in their city, as opposed to global availability of food. And so getting the food to where people need it is a challenge and part of what's driving this idea of malnutrition. And this term hidden hunger is really about the lack of proper nutrients. So again, in countries they may get enough basic calories to stay alive, but because they're not getting a mix of products, they're relying maybe on rice or corn or some other kind of basic carbohydrate. They're not getting proper minerals, vitamins, nutrients that are required to really sustain healthy life. So you can stay alive for a long time on a pretty monotonous diet, but it's not going to provide you all the nutrition that you need to really thrive and be at your best. And as we've talked about before, obesity is a growing challenge as well. One of, I guess you could call it a success of our food system, is that there are now more obese people globally than malnourished people. Unfortunately, the problem is that obesity is an indicator of malnutrition. Not undernutrition per se, but malnutrition. So again, if you're relying on fast food, processed foods, convenience foods, that's going to contribute to obesity, even as you're not getting the proper nutrition that you require. So you're not getting vitamins, nutrients, all of those things you need from having a diverse diet with healthy fruits, vegetables, those kinds of things. So certainly an issue for our communities, particularly in the United States. And some of the health impacts that come from malnutrition, as the graphic says, right, the cost of malnutrition is estimated to be about $3.5 trillion per year for the global economy. And so chronic malnutrition contributes to a host of health issues, things like child mortality, or children die either of starvation or malnutrition, a lack of nutrients. When people are malnourished, they're not going to succeed in school. They're not going to be able to be productive in a job, and so it reduces economic opportunity for people when they're malnourished. And so you get kind of into that vicious cycle of you're malnourished, so you can't work, so you can't work, so you don't have money, so you're malnourished, right? So it just creates this vicious cycle, contributing to sustained poverty, sustained malnutrition going forward. And particularly as it relates to obesity, what we're seeing is the increase in lifestyle diseases. So many cancers are caused by, maybe not caused by, but are influenced by obesity. Eating, again, processed foods and a high fat, high salt diet contributes to heart disease, diabetes, all of these chronic health issues that we are facing in this country that are killing more people now than communicable diseases that used to kill people, are largely a result of our eating habits, our lack of activity, those kinds of things. So some other challenges that come from food insecurity, corruption and civil war. As we've talked about before, in Syria, one of the contributing factors to the civil war there was a drought that reduced food production, contributed to hunger. And when people are hungry, they are going to do what they need to do to secure food for their families. And so we're seeing that in other nations as well. When we combine environmental change with loss of food production, we start to see civil unrest, civil wars, those kinds of things. And so it just complicates matters in trying to solve problems. Corruption is also a contributor to malnourishment because, again, as we talked about earlier in the semester, a lot of the aid that is given to developing nations is skimmed off the top by corrupt leaders and corrupt officials. And so even food aid sometimes is just stolen outright and then sold on the black market. Food aid can disrupt local production because farmers don't have a market for their product because this food aid is being given to them by other countries. So farmers are encouraged to not grow food, or not maybe encouraged necessarily, but because they don't have a market, they choose not to grow food because they can't sell it, they can't make any money doing it. And so again, there's all these disruptions that go along with access to food and so forth. So we've talked about food deserts. The link there is to just a video talking about food deserts in Minnesota. Minnesota is surprisingly one of the states that has a big challenge with food deserts, both in the urban environment of the Twin Cities, but also in rural communities. And so we've talked about these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but again, a food desert can be defined as no grocery store within 1 mile in urban areas, 10 miles in rural areas. And so I do want you to think about some of the challenges to not having access to a grocery store. Again, we mentioned some earlier with the issue of transit, the time it takes to go to a grocery store, the lack of ability to carry enough groceries on a bus to feed a family for more than a day or two, so you have to make frequent trips to the grocery store. All of those things just make it much harder for these already stressed families in low-income neighborhoods who are already dealing with job insecurity and all of the other challenges that they might face. Adding the burden of trying to grocery shop in a food desert is just another stressor on their lives. And food deserts are a policy issue, so it's not just about the fact that there's no market in these low-income communities, because often there is, right? We may think of low-income neighborhoods as being a place where there's not demand for particular products, but there really is. The problem is that oftentimes our development land use policies make it difficult to put grocery stores into these neighborhoods. Things like parking minimums, to where if you're going to put a grocery store in a neighborhood, you've got to have a giant parking lot. But if we're talking about low-income transit dependent neighborhoods, then a big parking lot's just wasted space, because most of the people accessing that grocery store are going to come on foot or on the bus. So if we changed our policies, we could actually promote the development of grocery stores in some of these lower income neighborhoods by making it more attractive and less costly for them to develop in those areas. And of course, there is a market issue as well. So people like fast food, it tastes good. And so even if there is a healthy alternative available, people will oftentimes choose the less healthy option. I think we can all, we've all made that choice in our lives, to where you go to the UC for lunch or for dinner, and it's like, well, there's the nice salad bar with all those great fresh healthy options. There's the Mongolian barbecue, like the wok section, where you can make a nice, veggie healthy bowl, and they'll cook it up for you right there. And then there's like pizza and french fries, and we choose the pizza and french fries. So even when given the option for healthy foods, people oftentimes will make the unhealthy choice, and that's just human nature. And that's why part of any program to deal with food insecurity also really needs to have an educational component to help teach people about proper nutrition, making better choices in their diet. And that's a hard thing to do, because healthy food doesn't taste as good as junk food. But if we start young, we start in the elementary school, preschool, those that age group, we can start to teach kids about healthy nutrition, about making smarter choices, and hopefully lay a foundation for better choices through their lives. And when you combine that education with access to fresh and healthy foods, you make it easier for people to make the right choice. And that's really what it comes down to, is we can't force people to do the right thing, but we can get people to make the right choice if it's easier for them to do so, and if they have the educational background to understand why making the healthy choice is the right one. So lots of issues here in terms of urban design and how we develop our communities to provide physical access, but also that educational component to build the human capital, right? Going back to our capital, 7 capitals of framework, right? Building the human capital so people have the understanding of why making a healthier choice matters and how it can better their lives. Sorry, a bit of a diversion there, but bear with me here. Alright, so food access becomes a problem again for many kids especially. Many kids get their at least 2 of their 3 meals a day. Some schools even have dinner from free and reduced lunches at school. And so our school system does much more than educate kids. It actually is a major provider of nutrition for children across the country. That's why many schools do have breakfast in the morning. They have lunch. Again, as I said, some have dinner as well, or some send a dinner home with the kids just to make sure that their students have a proper meal in the evening as well. And again, the benefit of that, why schools recognize the importance of having a robust food system for their students, is because kids can't learn when they're hungry. If any of y'all have gone to class, even if you've just skipped breakfast sometimes, or maybe you didn't have your morning coffee, right? You're kind of dazed, you're not focused, you're not learning if you're hungry. And so schools recognize that, and it's become an enormous priority for schools to provide, a healthy nutritional program for their students based around that. And that's why the government, the federal government, is such a big supporter of school lunches, and why so many kids do qualify for free and reduced price lunches. And you do hear those horror stories of schools, that cut kids off from lunch if they don't pay their bills, for kids that maybe don't qualify for the free program. And so you have these instances where people, will come in and pay off all the school lunch debt for a school and those kinds of things. But really, school lunch is kind of a backstop in our food access system across the country, making sure that if nothing else, kids can get a meal a day, and usually 2, because most schools do breakfast, in a safe setting. It's there, it's available. And so what can happen when schools close, either in the summertime or as we're seeing now with this coronavirus, one of the big challenges that school districts are trying to process is, how do we get food to the students who rely on the school for their meals? And so you've seen, there's some examples out there of school districts who are actually just using their bus drivers, who are now don't have anything to do with schools closed, and the bus drivers are going around and delivering food to the kids, or parents can congregate at the bus stop, where the kids get on the bus in the mornings, and the bus drivers will actually deliver food that's prepped at the school, and they'll bring it out to those families who need it at those bus stops during this coronavirus shutdown. And so again, recognizing the importance of school nutrition for families is an enormous service that schools provide outside of just basic education. So some of the food assistance programs that we have here in the United States, most of them are run through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and which creates kind of an interesting set of priorities for the food assistance programs, because to some degree, these food assistance programs are actually a farmer assistance program as much as they are about providing food to people. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture is obviously responsible for U.S. agriculture, and so much of the way we provide food assistance is actually geared towards benefiting farmers, creating a market for farmers' products. And so the Department of Ag will buy products from farmers and use them as kind of a foundation for food aid. And so that's why you see programs like WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children. Program geared specifically for mothers and children, is focused on things like dairy, cheese, vegetables, right? Because that's creating a market for farmers' products. SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Used to be called food stamps. Now it's SNAP, but that's just basically families get a certain budget per month for low-income families that they can use to purchase groceries, and there are some limits on what they can buy with that money. You can't buy things like soda and other empty calorie products, but families are able to use their SNAP budget to buy, basic foodstuffs that they need to feed their families. And then, of course, we've talked about the free school lunches and breakfasts and summer lunch programs as well. Many school districts and other federally supported programs offer food throughout the summertime. So again, those kids who are dependent on the school system for their nutrition have something during the summertime when they're not in school. They can either get it at the school or through another provider. Some cities have lunch programs at their community centers, those kinds of things. And there are local assistance programs as well, food pantries, community gardens, and so forth that are providing food for folks in the local community. So obviously here in the United States, we are the world's largest agricultural producer, but there are some challenges that we're facing in our food system. Farming is a high risk, hard work business, pretty low reward business, everything from trade wars to bad weather to natural disasters. There's any number of things that can put a crimp on a farmer's profits for the year. And so in the last year, 2018, I think it was 2018, maybe 2019, almost 10, you can see the numbers here, but in 2019, I think 800 dairy farms across Wisconsin closed. That's just here in Wisconsin. So what we're seeing is a lot of consolidation in agriculture, to where this idea of a family farm of a few hundred acres is becoming hard to sustain. We're really seeing more and more a transition to these big corporate farms. Part of the problem that we run into with that, obviously, is for the family farms that are going under. Those families now need to find another source of income. We're losing the heritage and tradition that goes along with family farming. For rural communities, those farms are the lifeblood of their economy, and so we're seeing towns lose population, lose retail and other employment opportunities as the farms around them decline, because these big corporate farms require fewer workers. So you see a drop in employment, fewer people around buying stuff from the stores, and just contributes to that sort of downward spiral that many of our rural communities are facing. And because of the lack of opportunity in farming, we're seeing farmers getting older. Average age now is 58, and it's not a growth industry. And so that again sort of contributes to the cycle of consolidation, because many family farms, as the older generation is retiring, their kids aren't wanting to farm in some cases, and so they don't have someone to take over the farm for them. So their option is either to sell it to maybe a developer if they're in an area where there is suburban growth happening, or sell it to a corporate entity that will take over and consolidate their farm, just because that younger generation isn't as interested in farming as others. So when we think about what makes a sustainable food system, we need to think back to our three legs or three pillars of sustainability. This idea of environmental sustainability, environmental health. So we want to think about a food production system that doesn't compromise environmental systems. We want to think about how we can produce enough food to manage a growing population, but do it in a way that ensures we don't have overuse of pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, that doesn't lead to soil depletion, that doesn't contribute to habitat loss and those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that we're protecting the environment while also being able to produce the food that we need. We want to think about economic health. We want to make sure that producers earn a living wage, that there is an economic benefit to being a farmer. We need to make sure that farming is an attractive job opportunity for people who want to make a decent living. Now, that's where that conflicts with the need for, or can conflict with the need for, affordable food as well, because obviously when dairy prices are super low for producers, that translate into lower prices at the grocery store. And we like having cheap groceries, but that in turn makes it really hard to make a living as a farmer. And so we need to figure out how we can balance those competing interests to ensure that farmers are supported adequately and that they're receiving a fair wage for the work that they're doing to produce our food. So certainly one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the U.S. food system is ensuring that farmers are making a decent living. And this idea of social health, basically that food is available and affordable for those who need it. We all need food, so we want to make sure that food is available and affordable for everyone, but certainly that means different things for different people. For some of us, available food means I can get the organic, grass-fed, free-range beef that I prefer, and for other people that just means they can get a pound of ground beef so they can make spaghetti for their family that night. They don't care if it's grass-fed or not. They just want to be able to afford protein for their family. And so what we mean when we talk about available and affordable is going to differ for different people, different priorities, different values. But we want to make sure that everyone has access to the food they need. They have options for fresh and healthy food that's available to them in their neighborhood, in their community, and that they can physically access it in a way that's convenient. So again, we're not forcing people to take an hour bus ride to a grocery store for, a day or two's worth of groceries that they can only take 3 bags on the bus. So every day or two they have to go back to the grocery store on that hour bus ride. That's not available food. That's a enormous challenge for people to deal with. Okay, so that concludes today's lecture on food security. And so what I want you to do for this assignment, and so just to kind of let you know how this is going to work, because obviously I can't do the normal sort of in-class activities that we do where that show me you're attending class and you're participating. We're going to have to kind of shift gears on that. So to make sure that you're actually going through these lectures, each lecture is going to have a very short, very quick, very easy assignment that needs to be done, basically taking the place of those little in-class activities that we do on the regular. They're not going to be graded necessarily, but they are going to count towards that participation portion of your grade. So take 5 minutes, and we're 37 minutes into this lecture, and so you're still getting a little bit of time back, but take a few minutes, answer this question. There's an assignment tab in the Canvas site with this lecture. You'll see it there. Just click on that tab, fill out the question there on Canvas directly, just like you do the reading quizzes, and that'll be that. So obviously, if you have any questions about this, you can certainly email me any questions you may have. And if you want some more information about this, you can Google some of this stuff about food security and so forth. Find some great information on the web as well. So anyway, that's the first one. Hopefully this isn't terrible for y'all. I know it's not ideal, and I appreciate your patience as we go through this process, and as you're bearing with me sitting here reading these lectures to you. Have a great day. Be safe. Make good choices. I will see you next time.